All right, so President Joe Biden is back doing Joe Biden things, this time specifically relating to student debt cancellation, where we are starting to get a little bit of a better picture in terms of the extent to which he is willing to go to help the nearly 40 million Americans who currently hold student debt. So here from CNBC, we have yet another example of Joe Biden and Democrats pushing needless austerity instead of using the full power that he has at his disposal as the president of the United States in order to actually materially help the American people in a substantive way. So here from CNBC, they say, as Biden administration leans towards $10,000 in student loan forgiveness, advocates push back. And yeah, I mean, they're pushing back rightfully so, because again, canceling $10,000 in student debt forgiveness, not only is it really honestly pathetic in terms of what he has the power to do. We know that according to the 1965 Higher Education Act, that basically Joe Biden as the president has the unilateral authority to walk on over to his Secretary of Education and say that you can wipe the entire slate clean. So he could be canceling the entirety of student debt. He could be going with the Chuck Schumer or Elizabeth Warren plan to cancel $50,000 in student debt, but he is choosing to do what he said he was going to do on the campaign trail and basically do a means-tested $10,000 in student debt forgiveness. So pretty much pathetically inadequate, at least in my opinion, but we got a take here from Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who I think pretty much summed it up well. So here from Common Dreams, they say we can do better than Biden's paltry student debt relief plan, says AOC. So a little bit of details here. They say Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on Friday joined economic justice advocates in rebuking President Joe Biden's reported plan to cancel just $10,000 in federal student loan debt for a means-tested selection of borrowers, warning that the proposal is too little for those who need it while excluding many desperate for relief. So here is basically the main tweet that she was coming out and getting into some more of her position on this. She said $10,000 means-tested forgiveness is just enough to anger the people against it and the people who need forgiveness the most. $10,000 relieves the most for people who owe the least. What relief is there for the most desperate? For them, interest rates will undo that $10,000 pretty fast. And she says we can do better. So obviously we can do better. And again, we do know, according to the 1965 Higher Education Act, that he has the power to cancel 100% of it. And the fact that he's even coming out here and saying that he's willing to do 10,000 basically means that he is admitting that he does unilaterally have the power. He doesn't have to wait for Congress, as he's been saying for basically months now that he wanted to do. He can do this via executive order, and basically this is just completely inadequate based on what he could do. But just to hammer home how absolutely laughable the Biden administration's position thus far has been in relation to student debt cancellation. So a couple of months ago, they actually put out, or I guess this is now almost a year ago, back from April 5th of 2021, they basically stalled and used a bunch of time to come up with this bullshit report on what Joe Biden's presidential authority enumerates for him on student debt cancellation. And they put out this report to the public. And I mean, literally basically 100% of it is completely redacted here. And the reason why this report was massively redacted is that the Joe Biden administration didn't want to admit that they do have the power to cancel student debt, because then that would bolster the left-wing case in favor of wiping the debt slate clean, on top of enacting other policies to address the problem of skyrocketing school costs and address the problem of like a lack of free college or free trade schools as well. So it's a multifaceted approach that you have to use when going about student debt cancellation. Obviously, if you just cancel and wipe the slate clean and then go back to business as usual, well, those debts are just going to immediately start accumulating again. So, you have to deploy all of these different policies in coordination with each other in order for student debt cancellation to even be effective in the first place. But they put out this report. It's almost entirely redacted. I mean, you can see here, again, like literally the first like 5-6 pages of this are just 100% redacted. And the reason for that is because he didn't want to admit that he had the power to do what he is now apparently planning on doing. But again, $10,000 is pretty embarrassing given what he has the power to do as the president of the United States. But they continue here with a little bit more details from the Common Dreams piece, saying Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez responded to reports about the plan, which would offer relief to individuals who earned less than $150,000 in the previous year. as advocates held a rapid response protest outside the White House to demand the Biden administration provide more ambitious relief. So hopefully these protests continue and the pressure continues to build on Biden. But they continue here with a quote saying $10,000 student debt relief just isn't enough, said Lauren Miller, the communications director for the Harvard Institute of Politics. And she continues saying, especially if it's not paired with huge reduction on interest rates, banning federal aid from for-profit colleges, and a massive increase in Pell Grants and free public college. So again, it's a multifaceted approach that you need when it comes to the cost of education or higher education in this country. But Biden basically is doing the very bare minimum that he can on student debt cancellation, while also not really doing anything substantive on any of these other policy issues. So again, doing the bare minimum that he can, pushing needless austerity, pointless means testing that is only going to make this more of a bureaucratic nightmare, is only going to lead to an increase in costs for student debt cancellation, and is going to push people outside the bounds that would otherwise need this student debt relief. Is just gonna, piss them off while simultaneously pissing off the people who are against student debt cancellation in the first place. So really just the worst of all worlds type of response that you could get here from Joe Biden. But they continue saying, after the rapid response protests were announced Friday morning, the Student Borrower Protection Center announced that an historic coalition of 529 labor and civil rights groups called on Joe Biden to cancel at least $50,000 of student debt, as pushed by Ayanna Pressley, Elizabeth Warren again, and Chuck Schumer. And the groups included the national labor unions such as the UAW, the United Auto Workers, and the SEIU, as well as the NAACP. So again, all of these different unions and organizations coming out in favor of this, which is, as they point out here, pretty much directly contradictory to the narrative that is pushed by people who are against student debt cancellation, in saying that it's going to disproportionately benefit the wealthy, it's going to just benefit these rich Ivy League kids, which is, kind of just ridiculous at face value, because obviously people who come from wealthy backgrounds, people who come from wealthy families, their parents are paying for their college. They're not taking on the student debt in the first place. But even if the student debt, if it was universal and it wasn't means tested, ended up going to a few families that didn't necessarily need it, well, so what? I mean, that's the whole point of having a universal program like free public college or universal student debt cancellation, or even on other issues like healthcare, for example. There's a reason why I'm in favor of something like Medicare for all, not Medicare for just some subset of the population who's struggling with their medical bills. No, it needs to be universal because it's easier to implement. It's much more politically advantageous. It's easier to keep locked in once you pass it in legislation. So all around, it makes it more efficient, oftentimes less costly, and honestly, again, if a couple stragglers get in there who didn't necessarily quote unquote deserve this student debt relief, well, so fucking what, because you're on the back end helping millions and millions of people and families from unburdening themselves for the crime of trying to get a higher education. But they continue down here with a little bit more details, saying, as Max Morin and Hannah Story Brown of the Revolving Door Project wrote in a Common Dreams op-ed on Friday, the administration's insistence on an artificially limited plan capping relief at $10,000 will come down the hardest on the most vulnerable. And they point out that 83% of black borrowers, canceling only $10,000 of debt would still leave them with a higher balance than their original amount, meaning, again, as AOC was pointing out there at the top, with the ridiculous interest rates that a lot of these school loans have on them. I mean, you're basically barely able to keep up with even the interest payments. And so $10,000, I mean, yeah, sure, it's like a little shot of adrenaline, but if you have tens of thousands of dollars in debt, then that might not even be enough to get you over the board with those interest payments that are just going to continue accumulating. But they continue saying, because over the last 2 decades, the median student debt balance for these borrowers quadrupled from $7,000 to $30,000. And finally, they point out here what should be a slam dunk opportunity to energize voters young and old, and especially voters of color, may instead become a bureaucratic mess that offers too little relief for too much complexity, which is exactly what student debt profiteers want from a loan forgiveness policy, if we are to have one at all. So again, this is just pushing austerity on behalf of a lot of these debt profiteers, as they're pointing out here, a lot of these corporations that are benefiting from this debt. That's really what this is to serve. I mean, $10,000 is a drop in the bucket. you're still going to have a plurality, if not an outright majority, of student loan borrowers who are still not going to be able to make their payments in a reliable fashion. So just completely ridiculous. And on top of that, you obviously have to remember the context of how this student debt crisis exploded in the first place. Largely, you could thank Joe Biden for that, as he was one of the biggest political players who was pushing for the legislation that made it basically impossible to discharge your student debt via bankruptcy laws. So, Joe Biden has responsibility directly for creating the crisis of student debt in the United States in the first place. And now he's turning around, imposing austerity when it's completely unnecessary. And again, whether it's on the economic front and the arguments that you can make surrounding that, right? Obviously, it would be economically advantageous for us as a country to wipe the slate clean, provide free college, free trade schools universally to the American people, because then they would be able to go and use that money instead of paying it back to the federal government via their student loans that they're having to pay back. They could go, invest in a house. They could pay for childcare. They could start a family. They could do so many different things that would inject that money directly back into the American economy. But on top of the economic arguments that you can make for student debt cancellation, you have the arguments that they're pointing out here. I mean, just that it's advantageous for them politically because not only is student debt cancellation widely popular among the American people, left, right, and center in many cases, depending on which threshold that you're talking about. But, I've talked about on this channel so many times that if you go and you dig into the data on where Joe Biden's approval rating has been disproportionately slipping, it's been disproportionately among young people. And so if your biggest trailing off in support is among young people, what could you do to earn back their support? I mean, you could do things like wiping the debt slate clean and canceling 100% of federally owned student loan debt. So, it's just one policy among many others that need to be implemented to address the problems within our higher education here in the United States. But again, on the political front, on the economic front, this is just completely woefully inadequate and is honestly just going to serve to piss off people on the right that are against student debt cancellation, and also people on the left who think that this is completely inadequate. But I wanted to give you a little bit of a rundown just very quickly here through Bernie Sanders' policy on student debt cancellation, as well as free college and trade schools, because this will give us a little bit of a benchmark in terms of what could be potentially possible in a moment like this if we had a president who wasn't an absolute neoliberal ghoul. So here from Bernie Sanders' website, College for All and Cancel Student Debt. So just some of the main points that he was trying to make here: cancel all existing federally owned student loan debt. So that's 45 million people who are holding $1.6 trillion in student debt. You cancel all of that. You wipe the slate clean. You implement debt-free college for all. So free community college, free public college, as well as trade schools. He was going to also invest in HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, and minority-serving institutions. He was going to end equity gaps in higher education attainment, and he was going to basically pay for it with a tax on Wall Street. So again, the narratives that you hear coming from conservatives that this is pulling money out of the pockets of working class Americans to pay for Ivy League educations, it's just completely bullshit. You could do all of these things, all of those major policies that we were talking about: free public college, free trade schools, canceling student debt, etc. You can do all of this by taxing the wealthiest Americans, and average working class Americans wouldn't see a single rise by even a penny on their yearly taxes. So yeah, again, that's kind of why you see all of these different trade unions coming out in favor of something like this, because it would just materially economically benefit average Americans. Okay, there's no argument here that it's some elitist policy or something like that, but we do already see a lot of these arguments taking place, even though Biden hasn't even officially done this measly $10,000 in student debt cancellation. So I tweeted this out the other day because I basically can see all of these different arguments already coming on the horizon. So I basically said, useless austerity. I can already see the narratives forming. If he does this, leftists will rightfully say that it's inadequate and won't be enough of a motivator for the midterms, especially with young people. Liberals will say that the left is never satisfied and that we're, enabling Republicans by not being excited by $10,000 in student debt. And then, of course, you're going to have conservatives who are going to be screaming about how Biden is a thieving communist, evil dictator, basically. But, all of these arguments are already starting to take place. I saw this absolutely ridiculous one here from Mueller, She Wrote, which is pretty much exactly as it seems, a deranged liberal podcast, apparently. But They wrote this thread, which I think is a perfect encapsulation of some of the monumental brain rot that exists within liberals in terms of the vote blue no matter who mindset. So they basically said, thread, if Biden forgives $10,000 in student debt and you have decided that you won't vote for Democrats because you want $50,000 in student debt cancellation, I have a favor to ask, and I'm being 100% serious. And they said, call up a parent of a slaughtered student or a loved one at Robb or Buffalo, or a family member of someone at Sandy Hook or Colorado AME, and tell them that you've decided to help elect Republicans who will keep allowing mass murderers because you didn't get enough debt relief. And they continue, it's going on this entire thing about how, if you don't support Democrats because of this $10,000 in student debt cancellation, that you're responsible for Republicans winning elections. It's just, completely deranged brain rot here. Obviously, one of the most fundamental political understandings that you can have is that it is up to politicians to earn votes, right? 100%. You cannot blame voters and expect that that is going to be, in and of itself, enough of a motivator for you to win elections. There's only a certain extent that you can go with lesser of two evils voting and lesser of two evils mindset and vote blue no matter who, especially when it relates to issues like gun control, which is, something we've seen a complete failure of the Democratic Party just this last week. I mean, we got, Joe Biden basically passing the buck off to Congress and saying that he has no power as the president to lobby or to fight for actual gun control measures that could get passed. He's not willing to pressure the members of his own party. And you got, motherfuckers like Nancy Pelosi going and doing robocalls for NRA A rating Henry Cuellar down in Texas in order to crush any progressive insurgency that would actually be fighting for a lot of those priorities that this deranged liberal podcast claims that Democrats are fighting for right now. So again, you can already see all of the arguments surrounding this lining up on the horizon. There's going to be a lot of tension surrounding this, assuming that Biden does it in the next couple of weeks or months. But it's an absolute drop in the bucket, and it's honestly just completely pathetic that this is the state of the Democratic Party, even as they are continuing to be on track to get absolutely slaughtered in the 2022 midterms. They still just refuse to use even a tiny fraction of their power in order to do something popular and good for the American people.